There's a place in Dearborn, Michigan, where you could walk in one end with iron ore and walk out the other with a finished automobile. 1.5 miles wide, 1 mile long, 93 buildings, 100,000 workers at its peak. The Ford River Rouge complex wasn't just a factory. It was an industrial city without residents, a monument to American manufacturing power, a place where raw materials transformed into the machines that put the world on wheels. And for decades, it worked exactly as Henry Ford envisioned, until it didn't. This is the story of how the world's most advanced factory became a symbol of everything Detroit lost. The vision. In 1915, Henry Ford bought 2,000 acres of swampy bottomland along the Rouge River in Dearborn. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. The property was marshland, prone to flooding, miles from anything useful. It sat at the confluence of the Rouge and Detroit rivers, just a few miles south of Detroit proper, but it might as well have been wilderness. There were no buildings worth mentioning, no infrastructure, nothing but mud and water and land that seemed good for absolutely nothing. Ford told people he was thinking about turning it into a bird sanctuary, a nature preserve, somewhere peaceful where birds could nest undisturbed by the noise and smoke of industry. He painted himself as a lover of nature, someone who wanted to preserve this wetland habitat for future generations to enjoy. Some people actually believed him. He was lying through his teeth. Ford had something else in mind entirely, something nobody had ever attempted before on this scale. He wanted total control, complete autonomy, independence from every supplier, every middleman, every person who stood between raw materials and finished automobiles. The Highland Park plant had made Ford rich and famous with the Model T, revolutionizing manufacturing with the moving assembly line and making automobiles affordable for ordinary Americans. But Highland Park relied on thousands of suppliers for parts, materials, components. Every piece came from someone else. Every delay, every quality problem, every price increase came from dependency on outsiders. Ford hated that dependency more than almost anything. He wanted to own everything, control everything, answer to nobody. Why should he pay others to transform his raw materials into steel, rubber, glass when he could do it himself? Why should he worry about the cost of electricity when he could build his own power plant and generate exactly what he needed? Why should he trust suppliers when he could make everything internally? The concept was called vertical integration, though Ford didn't care much about academic terminology. He just knew he wanted to buy iron ore at one end of his facility and drive finished automobiles out the other, with every single step in between happening under his direct control, on his property, by his workers, according to his standards. No excuses, no delays, no surprises. At Highland Park, Ford had perfected the moving assembly line. The Rouge would be his next revolution, complete control of the entire production process from nature's raw materials to consumer's driveway. If it worked, he'd be unstoppable. If it failed, he'd lose everything. The bird sanctuary story was convenient cover while he quietly assembled one of the largest industrial sites in America. By the time people figured out what he was really planning, Ford owned the land, had the vision mapped out in his mind, and was ready to move. Nobody could stop him even if they wanted to. Construction began in April 1917, triggered not by Ford's ambitions, but by war. The United States was entering World War I, and Under-Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, personally asked Henry Ford to build Eagle boats, submarine hunters designed to patrol for German U-boats threatening Allied shipping. Ford agreed, seeing opportunity in the government's desperation. The Navy needed boats fast, and Ford promised to deliver. Building B rose in 1918, a massive 3-story structure designed specifically for shipbuilding. It was the first substantial building on the Rouge site, and it became the foundation for everything that followed. Ford dredged and widened the Rouge River dramatically to accommodate the boats, fundamentally changing the waterway to serve his industrial vision. The engineering required was substantial. The river had to be wide enough and deep enough for boats to navigate, with proper docking facilities and infrastructure to support construction. The Eagle boats never saw combat. World War I ended in November 1918, before the Ford-built submarine hunters ever deployed. The Navy cancelled most of the order. Some people called it a waste, all that effort for boats that never fired a shot at the enemy. But Ford saw it differently. The Eagle boat project proved something crucial to his larger plans. It showed that the Rouge River could be widened enough to bring in massive lake freighters carrying iron ore, coal, and limestone. Raw materials could be delivered directly to the factory by water, eliminating the need for costly overland transport. Ford's vertical integration dream suddenly became physically possible in ways it never could have been at Highland Park, which lacked water access for heavy cargo. The infrastructure built for wartime shipbuilding laid the groundwork for peacetime industrial dominance. Between 1918 and 1928, Ford built what became the largest integrated factory in the world. The construction process itself was staggering in scope. Architect Albert Kahn, one of the most renowned industrial architects of his era, designed most of the buildings. Kahn specialized in factory design, and he created modernist industrial structures that were revolutionary for their time, combining functionality with architectural innovation. His glass plant, completed in 1925, featured massive glass panels in walls that stretched 760 feet long and 240 feet wide, flooding the workspace with natural light. It was beautiful in its own stark way, and it proved that factory buildings didn't have to be dark, oppressive dungeons. Natural light improved both working conditions and product quality. Workers could see what they were doing. The glass plant replaced Ford's previous facility in Highland Park, centralizing production at the Rouge. His tyre plant, finished on January 30th, 1938, measured over 800 feet long and 240 feet wide, with a distinctive butterfly roof and similar large glass panels flooding the interior with light. These buildings weren't just functional boxes. They were architectural statements about what industrial design could be, marrying form and function in ways that influenced factory architecture worldwide for decades. The completed complex, finished in 1928, measured an almost incomprehensible 1.5 miles wide by 1 mile long. 93 buildings covering nearly 16 million square feet of factory floor space. Walking from one end to the other took significant time. You could get lost in there if you didn't know the layout. The numbers alone don't capture what Ford created, but try to imagine it. This wasn't just a big factory. This was industrial self-sufficiency on a scale never before achieved in human history. The Rouge had its own massive docks where Ford-owned lake freighters unloaded iron ore from Ford-owned mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Those ships, operated by Ford's own fleet, travelled the Great Lakes carrying hundreds of tons of ore at a time, docking at facilities Ford built specifically to receive them. The whole system was Ford-controlled from mine to dock to factory floor. Inside the complex, 100 miles of internal railroad track connected buildings and moved materials between operations. Ford even bought his own railroad, the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton, in 1920 to speed delivery to and from the Rouge. Later, he created the Ford Rouge Railroad with 110 miles of track, 16 locomotives moving materials constantly. 27 miles of conveyor belts carried parts and materials through the production process, creating a continuous flow that never stopped. 53,000 machine tools performed every operation imaginable. The scale was simply staggering. The facility included blast furnaces where iron ore was smelted into molten iron, heated to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Open hearth steel mills where that iron was refined into steel. A rolling mill that shaped steel into sheets, bars and forms. Foundries that cast engine blocks and other heavy components. Metal stamping facilities where those steel sheets became fenders, hoods, doors, roof panels, engine casting plants, frame and assembly plants, transmission plants, radiator plants, tool and die shops that created and maintained the precision instruments needed for every operation. But the facilities went beyond just automotive production. The complex included a cement plant that processed limestone into cement used in construction throughout the operation, a glass plant that turned sand into windows and windshields using a continuous process Ford helped develop, producing higher quality glass at lower cost than competitors. A tyre plant where rubber became the wheels that put cars on the road. Byproducts plants that took waste materials from steel production and transformed them into petroleum products, paints, fertilizers, and charcoal. Nothing was wasted. Everything had value. Every material got used somehow. Ford even built a soybean conversion plant in later years, grinding soybeans into materials that could be molded into plastic auto parts. He experimented constantly with new materials and processes, always looking for ways to reduce costs and increase self-sufficiency. The power plant alone was massive, a cathedral of industrial energy generation, producing enough electricity to light a city the size of Detroit itself. Twin Babcock and Wilcox boilers, each capable of carrying 200 pounds of steam pressure, generated the energy that powered the entire complex. These weren't small units tucked in a corner somewhere. They were enormous structures requiring constant attention from skilled operators, burning a mixture of natural gas, pulverized coal, and blast furnace gas. At times, the Rouge generated so much surplus power that Ford sold electricity to Detroit Edison Company, essentially operating as a utility company in addition to being an automaker. Ford ordered duplicate systems for all critical infrastructure because he couldn't tolerate downtime or dependency on outside power sources. If one boiler failed, another immediately took over. If one generator broke, others compensated. The redundancy meant the Rouge almost never stopped for lack of power or mechanical failure. It was engineered to run continuously, perpetually, endlessly churning out automobiles regardless of what broke down or what went wrong. The scope of Ford's resource ownership extended far beyond the Rouge site itself. He owned 700,000 acres of forest land in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, providing lumber for car bodies and wooden components. Those forests included sawmills and lumber operations that processed trees into usable materials, all Ford-owned and Ford-operated. He owned iron mines and limestone quarries covering vast territories in northern Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The Mesabi Range in Minnesota held some of America's richest iron ore deposits, and Ford controlled significant portions of those reserves. Mining operations there employed thousands, extracting ore that travelled by rail to Ford's docks on the Great Lakes, then by Ford's ships to the Rouge. He owned coal mines covering thousands of acres in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Coal fired the blast furnaces, powered the boilers, fueled the entire operation. Ford wanted to ensure he'd never run short, never face price increases from suppliers who knew he depended on them. Owning the mines meant controlling costs and supply. He even purchased and operated a rubber plantation called Fordlandia in Brazil. The project was ambitious but troubled, plagued by labour problems, agricultural challenges, and local resistance. It never achieved Ford's goal of rubber self-sufficiency, but it demonstrated just how far he'd go to escape dependency on others. If he could grow his own rubber trees in the Amazon and ship raw rubber to Detroit for processing, he would. The fact that the plantation mostly failed didn't diminish his determination to try. To bring all these materials from mines, forests and plantations to the Rouge, Ford operated his own fleet of massive ore freighters plying the Great Lakes. The SS William Clay Ford and other vessels carried hundreds of tons of raw materials on each voyage, making regular runs from mining regions to Dearborn. Ford also operated an entire regional railroad company, the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton, purchased specifically to move materials and finished vehicles more efficiently than relying on other rail lines. Ford's ambition for complete self-sufficiency was never totally realized. At no time did he have fewer than 6,000 suppliers serving the Rouge, providing specialized components, materials, or services that Ford couldn't economically produce himself. But no one before or since has come as close to true vertical integration on such a massive industrial scale. The dream was impossible, but Ford got closer than anyone thought possible. One new car rolled off the line every 49 seconds. Every day, workers smelted more than 1,500 tons of iron and manufactured 500 tons of glass. The Rouge truly was a city without residents, a self-contained industrial empire that could turn raw materials into finished automobiles, all within one sprawling complex. The first vehicles assembled at the Rouge weren't cars, but tractors. Ford's Fordson tractor, the world's first mass-produced farm tractor, began production there in 1921. Ford wanted to revolutionize farming the same way he'd revolutionized transportation. In 1927, after the Model T ended production, the Rouge achieved full automotive ore-to-assembly capability with the new Model A. Building B became the heart of assembly operations, a role it would maintain for decades. People came from around the world to see the Rouge. Economic development specialists, industrialists, engineers, artists, filmmakers all made pilgrimages to witness what Ford had built. The plant inspired similar facilities worldwide. Renault's Ile-Séguin factory in 1920, Gaz's factory in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Volkswagen's Wolfsburg plant in 1938, Fiat's Mirafiori factory in 1939. The Rouge became the template for modern automotive manufacturing. Free tours began in 1924, and at their peak, approximately 1 million visitors per year walked through the complex, marveling at the scale and efficiency of Ford's industrial cathedral. Charlie Chaplin studied the Rouge for his 1936 film Modern Times, using its assembly lines as inspiration for his satire of industrial labor. In 1932, Mexican muralist Diego Rivera spent a month at the Rouge studying its operations, machines, and workers. The result was his Detroit Industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts, monumental frescoes that captured the power and complexity of modern industrial production. This was Detroit at its apex, American manufacturing at its most powerful. One man's vision of industrial self-sufficiency realized on a scale that seemed impossible. And it worked. For decades, it worked brilliantly. But that success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The workers. The Rouge needed bodies. Lots of them. When Ford announced in 1914 that he'd pay $5 a day, workers came from everywhere. That wage was revolutionary, roughly double what other factories paid. Ford didn't raise wages out of generosity. He did it because turnover at his Highland Park plant was crushing. Workers hated the assembly line's repetitive, mind-numbing work and quit constantly. The $5 day was meant to make people stay. It worked. Word spread fast. Italians escaping Mussolini's growing fascist power, Russians fleeing revolution and upheaval, Southern black Americans seeking escape from Jim Crow oppression, Eastern Europeans looking for opportunity. They all heard about the $5 day and came to Detroit. Thousands lined up outside the Rouge, sometimes starting at 2 in the morning in winter, whenever word went out that Ford was hiring. Former UAW leader Doug Fraser recalled thousands of workers forming lines that stretched for blocks, all hoping for a chance at a factory job that paid better than anything they'd ever imagined. But that $5 came with conditions. Ford created the sociological department to investigate workers' private lives. They'd visit homes unannounced, checking if families lived according to Ford's standards of cleanliness, sobriety, and moral behaviour. Immigrants had to attend English classes. Workers couldn't drink alcohol. Ford wanted to reshape not just how people worked, but how they lived. Inside the Rouge, conditions were brutal. The heat from blast furnaces made summer work almost unbearable. The noise was deafening. The air quality was terrible. Injuries were common. The pace was relentless. Workers called it the sweatshop or the butcher house because of how hard the work was, how little regard management showed for worker safety or comfort. Ford's service department, run by Harry Bennett, kept workers in line through intimidation and surveillance. Bennett, a former boxer and personal associate of Henry Ford, controlled a quasi-military force that watched workers constantly, both inside the plant and outside it. Workers were routinely followed home, their activities monitored, their conversations reported. Speaking favourably about unions could get you fired. Or worse. The Rouge's workforce was remarkably diverse for its time. By the 1930s, it employed workers from dozens of countries speaking dozens of languages. Management used this diversity as a tool, playing ethnic groups against each other to prevent unity and organisation. Different nationalities often worked in different departments, making solidarity difficult. But 3 events would forever change the relationship between Ford and its workers, transforming the Rouge from Ford's kingdom into a battlefield for workers' rights. The Hunger March. March 7th, 1932. The Great Depression had devastated Detroit. Ford had laid off thousands of Rouge workers, and those still employed faced reduced hours and wages. Unemployment in Detroit exceeded 30%. People were starving. The city's relief programs were collapsing under demand. About 3,000 unemployed workers, many of them former Rouge employees, marched from Detroit to Dearborn to present Henry Ford with a list of demands. They wanted jobs. They wanted relief for the unemployed. They wanted better working conditions for those still employed. They wanted the right to organise without intimidation. The marchers reached the Ford-owned streets approaching the Rouge complex. Dearborn police, controlled by Ford, ordered them to disperse. The marchers refused. Police responded with tear gas. The crowd pushed forward anyway. Then police and Ford security guards opened fire. It wasn't warning shots. They aimed into the crowd and shot to kill. Dozens were injured. 5 men died: Joe York, Coleman Lenny, Joe Bussell, who was only 16 years old, Joe de Blasio, and Curtis Williams. 60 protesters were arrested, some chained to their hospital beds while they recovered from gunshot wounds. 5 days later, a funeral procession for the dead marchers drove down Woodward Avenue. 30,000 people gathered to express sympathy and outrage. The brutality shocked even a city accustomed to corporate violence against workers. Detroit's Communist Party organised the funeral, and the murdered workers became martyrs for labour rights. Ford tried to spin the massacre as the work of outside agitators, communist troublemakers who'd provoked the violence. But everybody knew the truth. These were local Detroit people, former Ford workers who'd been discarded when profits dropped. The Hunger March radicalised a generation of Detroit workers and set the stage for what came next. Battle of the Overpass, May 26, 1937. The United Auto Workers had successfully organised General Motors and Chrysler through dramatic sit-down strikes. Ford remained the last holdout among Detroit's big 3 automakers. Henry Ford swore he'd never recognize a union at his facilities. He relied on Harry Bennett and the service department to make sure that never happened. Walter Reuther, Richard Frankenstein, Robert Cantor, and J.J. Kennedy arrived at the Miller Road pedestrian overpass at Gate 4 of the Rouge complex. They had a permit from the city of Dearborn to distribute literature. The leaflets demanded a 6-hour workday for $8, compared to the 8-hour day for $6 then in place. They titled the campaign Unionism, Not Fordism. About 90,000 workers were employed at the Rouge in 1937. The union organisers arrived at shift change, timing their campaign for maximum visibility. Women from UAW Local 174's Ladies Auxiliary came with green berets and leaflets to hand out. Clergymen came as neutral observers. Reporters and photographers came to document the event. Detroit News photographer James Scotty Kilpatrick asked the union leaders to pose for a photo. As Reuther, Frankenstein, Cantor, and Kennedy smiled for the camera, about a dozen men from Ford's service department approached them. What happened next lasted only minutes, but became one of the most famous incidents in American labor history. Bennett's thugs grabbed the union organisers and beat them savagely. They pulled Frankenstein's coat over his head and arms, classic street hood style, and beat him until his face was bloodied and his clothes were torn. They picked up Reuther and repeatedly threw him down a flight of stairs. They attacked the women from the Ladies Auxiliary. They went after reporters and photographers. 16 unionists were injured, including 7 women. Frankenstein's face was cut and swollen, his shirt blood-stained. Reuther suffered a swollen skull and bruises across his body. Ford security tried to destroy all photographic evidence, smashing cameras and seizing film, but Kilpatrick hid some of his film rolls and gave security blank rolls instead. When those photographs were published, they destroyed Ford's public image. Here was proof, visual documentation, that Ford employed hired thugs to violently attack workers attempting to organize legally. Harry Bennett claimed the union had provoked the attack deliberately to create propaganda. Nobody believed him. The photographs showed the truth too clearly. The National Labour Relations Board pursued Ford for violating the Wagner Act, which prohibited employers from interfering with workers' right to organise. The evidence was overwhelming. Ford tried raising wages after the incident, hoping to buy loyalty and prevent unionisation. It was too late. The Battle of the Overpass became a rallying cry for the UAW. In 1941, workers at the Rouge went on strike, and this time Ford couldn't stop it. The company finally signed a contract with the UAW on June 20, 1941, becoming the last of Detroit's Big Three to recognise the union. The agreement transformed the Rouge from a kingdom ruled by Henry Ford and Harry Bennett into a unionised workplace where workers had rights, protections, and a voice. The golden years. For decades after unionisation, the Rouge hummed with productive power. World War II turned the facility into an arsenal of democracy. The Rouge produced jeeps, aircraft engines, components, armour plates, tyres, tubes. The complex expanded to meet wartime demand, and employment peaked at over 120,000 workers during the war years. After the war, the Rouge returned to civilian production, churning out the cars that put post-war America on wheels. The 1950s and 1960s were peak years. The Thunderbird, Ford's iconic two-seater introduced in 1954, came from the Rouge. The Mustang, perhaps Ford's most legendary car, began production there in the 1960s. These weren't just cars. They were cultural icons, symbols of American prosperity and freedom. By 1960, the Rouge's workforce demographics had shifted dramatically. African American workers now comprised 65% of employees, though only 3.5% were considered skilled labourers. The plant that had once used diversity to prevent unity had become a majority black workplace, though systemic discrimination in training and promotion persisted. The union fought those battles too. In 1949, a caucus formed to protect African American workers' rights, but their demands were dismissed through red-baiting tactics. The leadership accused them of communist sympathies, using Cold War paranoia to avoid addressing racial discrimination. Progress came slowly, fought for every step of the way. Through it all, the Rouge kept producing. Families worked generation after generation at the plant. Fathers brought sons. Uncles brought nephews. The Rouge became more than just a workplace. It was a community, an identity, a way of life for thousands of families who depended on those paychecks and that union contract. Tours resumed after their wartime suspension. Visitors continued coming to marvel at the scale and complexity of the operation. The Rouge remained a tourist attraction, a symbol of American industrial might, proof that Detroit and American manufacturing remained world leaders. But the world was changing in ways that would make the Rouge's integrated vertical model obsolete, the beginning of the end. The 1970s hit Detroit hard. The energy crisis made gas-guzzling American cars suddenly unappealing. Japanese and European manufacturers offered smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles that Americans increasingly preferred. Quality problems plagued American automakers, while imports developed reputations for reliability. The severe recession of the early 1980s devastated manufacturing nationwide. Detroit suffered worse than most cities. Unemployment soared, plants closed. The Rouge, which had once seemed invincible, started shedding jobs and operations. In 1981, Ford spun off the Rouge's steel-making operations into a separate company. In 1989, that company became Rouge Steel, and Ford gave up ownership of all Rouge River frontage, boat docks, and about 45% of the original 2,000 acres. Henry Ford's dream of complete vertical integration died that day. The Rouge could no longer turn iron ore into steel, into car parts, all under Ford's control. Employment dropped steadily. Buildings sat empty. Operations that had run continuously for decades shut down. The glass plant, Albert Kahn's modernist masterpiece, was demolished. Workshops and warehouses were abandoned. Whole sections of the complex became industrial ghost towns. By 1992, only Mustang production remained at the Dearborn assembly plant. Ford planned to replace the Mustang with the front-wheel drive Ford Probe, which would have ended Mustang production entirely and likely closed the Rouge for good. Public outcry forced Ford to reconsider. Mustang enthusiasts protested loudly, and sales surged as people rallied to save the iconic car. The fourth-generation Mustang became a success, which saved the Rouge temporarily. But the reprieve was fragile. The plant needed billions in upgrades. Environmental pressures to clean up decades of industrial pollution mounted. The economics of maintaining old brownfield facilities versus building new greenfield plants made the Rouge look increasingly untenable. Yet the Rouge community refused to accept closure quietly. Families who'd worked there for generations, union members who'd fought for decades to build UAW Local 600 into a power, workers who'd given their careers to the plant. They weren't willing to walk away without a fight. The Rouge had become their identity, their heritage, their lives. Tragedy. February 1st, 1999, approximately 1:20 in the afternoon. Brian Papke of Allen Park was working at the Rouge when everything went dark. Then came the explosion. Boiler number 6 in the Rouge powerhouse exploded with devastating force. The blast was so powerful it blew out windows across the site. Debris scattered everywhere. A plume of black smoke rose so high it could be seen for miles. Workers described a scene from hell. 6 men died. Donald Harper, 58, a pipe fitter with 35 years at the Rouge, died instantly in the initial blast. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more men succumbed to their terrible injuries. Cody Boatwright, 51. Ken Anderson, 44. John Arsenault, 45. Ron Moritz, 46. Warren Blow, 51. 14 others were critically injured, many with severe burns covering large portions of their bodies. Workers who witnessed the aftermath described skin hanging in sheets, yellow and peeling. People burned so badly they were unrecognizable. The injured were rushed to burn units in Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Toledo. The fire department battled flames for hours. At least 45 ambulances stayed at the Rouge for hours. Hospitals across the region went on full disaster alert, clearing emergency rooms and preparing for mass casualties. Ford evacuated the entire complex. Workers and management worried the explosion might spread through underground tunnels connecting the powerhouse to other buildings, potentially triggering a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire industrial complex. Workers who made it to emergency cut-off valves likely saved hundreds or thousands of lives by preventing the disaster from spreading. Investigations revealed the cause: a natural gas leak ignited during maintenance work on the boiler. The boiler was being shut down for its annual inspection, a routine procedure that should have been safe, but safety devices had been defeated or removed. Pressure relief valves and related alarms weren't working. There were no posted written procedures for shutting down the boiler. The procedures varied by shift, with different crews using different methods. Gas inadvertently entered the furnace for 1 to 2 minutes, building up until it exploded. This wasn't a random act of God. This was preventable. Workers had reported leaking valves repeatedly. Replacement valves were sitting on a wooden pallet, waiting to be installed when the explosion occurred. The powerhouse had a history: burns in 1986, an explosion in 1989 that killed 2 subcontract workers and released asbestos, safety complaints in 1996 that led to citations and fines. The blast happened while Ford was conducting a multi-billion-dollar cost-cutting campaign. Maintenance had been deferred. Safety protocols had deteriorated. The 80-year-old powerhouse was scheduled to be replaced with a new facility in 2000, but Ford had kept running the old plant right up until it exploded. OSHA investigated. So did the state of Michigan. So did Ford and the UAW jointly. They interviewed over 160 employees, examined 30,000 photographs, reviewed 75 hours of videotape, and 500,000 pages of documents. The findings confirmed what workers already knew: inadequate procedures, defeated safety systems, lack of proper training, corporate negligence. Ford settled with Michigan OSHA for $7 million, including a record $1.5 million civil penalty, the largest ever levied in Michigan following a workplace death investigation. The money went to burn treatment research, employee safety programs, and monitoring systems. Ford avoided criminal prosecution as part of the settlement. Bronze plaques were installed at the complex honouring the 6 dead workers. A memorial went up in 2004 with their photographs. The charred, destroyed powerhouse sat abandoned for years, a grim monument to what happens when profit takes precedence over safety. When cost-cutting endangers lives, when the pursuit of efficiency ignores the human cost, what remains? The Dearborn Assembly Plant closed on May 10, 2004. A red convertible 2004 Ford Mustang GT rolled off the line as the final vehicle built at the historic facility where assembly had begun in 1918. Demolition of the historic buildings was completed in 2008. Where Building B once stood, where Eagle boats were built, and generations of cars were assembled, there's now a 3,000-space parking lot. But the Rouge didn't die entirely. Ford made a decision to reinvent rather than abandon the complex. In 1999, architect William McDonough entered into an agreement to redesign the 85-year-old 1,212-acre facility. The plan was revolutionary: transformed the Rouge into a sustainable, environmentally friendly manufacturing complex for the 21st century. The centerpiece was a green roof on the Dearborn truck plant. More than 10 acres of sedum, a low-growing ground cover, was planted on 1.1 million square feet of roof space. The sedum retains and cleanses rainwater, moderates building temperature, and saves energy. It's part of an $18 million rainwater treatment system that cleans 20 billion gallons of water annually, saving Ford from building a $50 million mechanical treatment facility. In September 2020, Ford announced construction of the Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, a $700 million facility to produce the F-150 Lightning electric truck. President Joe Biden toured the plant in May 2021, driving an F-150 Lightning and endorsing electric vehicles in a speech at the facility. Today, the Rouge Center employs about 6,000 workers across 6 Ford factories on 600 acres of land. That's down from 100,000 workers on 2,000 acres at the peak, but it's survival. The complex still builds trucks, still employs thousands, still represents Ford's largest single industrial site. Tours resumed in 2004 in cooperation with the Henry Ford Museum, featuring multimedia presentations and views of the modern assembly floor. In 2017, about 148,000 visitors toured the facility, far fewer than the million per year at the peak, but still substantial interest in seeing what remains of Ford's industrial cathedral. The abandoned powerhouse, that charred monument to the 1999 tragedy, stood for over 2 decades before demolition finally began. Urban explorers photographed the ruins, documenting the decay. YouTube channels like The Proper People produced videos touring the abandoned structure, showing massive smokestacks, empty turbine halls, and the scars of the explosion that killed 6 men. Severstal North America, a Russian steelmaker, now runs steel operations on portions of the former Rouge site. The vertical integration is gone. The self-sufficiency is gone. The dream of one man controlling everything from iron ore to finished automobile is gone. But something survived. The Rouge still makes vehicles, still employs thousands, still anchors Dearborn's economy. UAW Local 600 still represents workers. The Union logo shares space with Ford's on the rebuilt Miller Road overpass where the Battle of the Overpass occurred, a permanent reminder of the violence and the victory. The legacy. The Rouge was never abandoned in the traditional sense, never left to rot like so many Detroit industrial sites. Packard's sprawling factory sits empty and crumbling. The Michigan Central Station stood vacant for decades before recent renovation. Countless smaller factories throughout Detroit were simply walked away from, left to decay and collapse. Ford invested billions to transform the Rouge rather than let it die. But what exists today isn't what Henry Ford built. It's a fragment, a shadow, a reminder of something much larger that once dominated this landscape. The Rouge represented a specific moment in industrial history when vertical integration made sense economically and practically. When one company could own mines and forests and rubber plantations and railroads and ships, and transform all those resources into finished products more efficiently than anyone else. When controlling every step of production from raw material to consumer meant lower costs, better quality, faster production. That moment passed decisively in the late 20th century. Globalization, just-in-time inventory management, specialized suppliers who could produce components better and cheaper than any integrated manufacturer, outsourcing to low-wage regions, all the trends that defined late 20th century manufacturing made the Rouge's model obsolete. Why own iron mines when you can buy steel cheaper from specialized mills? Why operate rubber plantations when global suppliers offer better prices? Why maintain your own railroad when contract shipping costs less? The economics that made vertical integration attractive in the 1920s and 30s had completely reversed by the 1980s and 90s. The human cost of that transition was enormous and rarely fully acknowledged. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs as the Rouge shed operations and employment. Families who'd worked at the Rouge for generations, where grandfather brought father, who brought son into the plant, saw that heritage end abruptly. Communities that had grown up around the Rouge, dependent on those paychecks and that economic foundation, watched as employment collapsed and the economic base crumbled. When a factory employing 100,000 workers shrinks to 6,000, the ripple effects spread far beyond the factory walls. Stores lose customers, restaurants close, housing values collapse, tax revenues plummet, schools face budget crises. The entire economic ecosystem that had sustained itself on Rouge wages finds itself suddenly struggling to survive. The consequences cascaded through Dearborn and the broader Detroit region for decades. But the Rouge also represented something else that transcends its industrial function: the power of organised labour to fight for dignity and rights against corporate power. The Hunger March, the Battle of the Overpass, decades of union organising and collective action, all of that happened because workers refused to accept being treated as disposable machinery, as interchangeable parts that could be used up and discarded. They demanded to be treated as human beings deserving of safety, fair wages, and respect. Those battles were never fully won, never permanently resolved. The 6 men who died in the 1999 power plant explosion died because the lessons of the 1930s labour struggles had been forgotten or ignored. Because cost-cutting and profit maximising had overwhelmed safety considerations. Because the same forces that led to the Hunger March massacre and the Battle of the Overpass beatings had never truly gone away, just evolved into new forms that were sometimes harder to see and fight. The explosion happened during a massive cost-cutting campaign. Maintenance was deferred to save money. Safety protocols deteriorated to speed operations. Training was reduced to cut expenses. The 80-year-old powerhouse that should have been replaced the years earlier kept running because replacing it cost money and shutting it down meant lost production. When it finally exploded, 6 men paid with their lives for those financial decisions made in boardrooms far from the boiler room floor. The Rouge inspired factories worldwide, becoming the template that industrial planners everywhere studied and emulated. The Soviet Union sent engineers to learn from it, implementing similar systems in their massive automotive plants. Volkswagen copied Ford's methods when building Wolfsburg. Renault studied the Rouge for their Ile-Séguin factory. Fiat built Mirafiori based on Rouge principles. The influence on global manufacturing was profound and lasting, even as the Rouge itself declined and transformed. Today, when politicians and business leaders talk about bringing manufacturing back to America, about rebuilding industrial capacity, about making things again instead of just moving money around through financial engineering, they're often talking about recreating what the Rouge represented at its peak. Self-sufficiency instead of dependency on foreign suppliers. Jobs for tens of thousands instead of stock buybacks for shareholders. Products stamped "Made in America" that were genuinely made here from start to finish, with American labour and American materials and American expertise. But they're also romanticising a past that had brutal realities they conveniently forget to mention. The Rouge was built on hard, dangerous, often degrading labour performed by workers who had few rights and fewer protections. It worked people until they broke physically and mentally, then discarded them when they could no longer maintain the brutal pace. It fought unions with violence, using hired thugs to beat organisers bloody while police looked the other way. It polluted the air and water for decades, poisoning the environment and communities surrounding it without regard for long-term consequences. The Golden Age, wasn't golden for everyone who lived through it. The prosperity was real for many, but it came at costs that are often erased from nostalgic memories. The wages Ford paid were revolutionary, yes, but they came with invasive surveillance of workers' private lives. The jobs were plentiful, yes, but they were physically exhausting and mentally numbing. The production was impressive, yes, but it generated environmental damage that took generations to begin addressing. The Hunger March massacre happened during this supposed golden age. The Battle of the Overpass happened when the Rouge was at peak employment and production. Workers died from industrial accidents regularly throughout the Rouge's history, though most didn't make headlines like the 1999 explosion. The past we sometimes long to return to wasn't simple or uncomplicated. It was messy, violent, unjust in many ways, even as it was productive and profitable and seemingly powerful. The transformed Rouge, with its green roof designed by sustainability architect William McDonough and its sophisticated rainwater management systems, represents a different vision of industrial production. Manufacturing that doesn't destroy the environment it operates in, production that operates within emissions limits and environmental regulations, workplaces where employees have unions, protections, safety standards enforced by law rather than ignored for convenience. It's smaller than the Peak Rouge, employs far fewer people than the glory days, produces fewer vehicles than the 1930s operation. But it exists in a world where those who work there have rights their predecessors fought and sometimes died to secure. They have union representation through UAW Local 600. They have safety regulations enforced by federal and state agencies. They have pollution limits that protect surrounding communities. They work in a facility that at least attempts to operate sustainably, rather than simply consuming resources and generating waste without concern. That's something. That's progress, even if it's accompanied by fewer jobs and reduced economic impact. The question Detroit and America faces isn't whether to return to the Rouge's golden age. That's impossible, even if it were desirable. The question is whether American manufacturing can find a sustainable path forward that provides good jobs while operating responsibly within environmental and social limits. Whether industry can exist without destroying communities and exploiting workers. Whether we can make things at scales that matter while treating both people and planet with something resembling respect. The Rouge stands as both warning and hope in that conversation. Warning of what happens when we forget the human cost of production, when we prioritize efficiency and profit above safety and dignity. Warning that even the mightiest industrial complexes can become obsolete when economic conditions shift. Warning that communities built around single massive employers are vulnerable when those employers change or shrink or disappear, but also hope that transformation is possible, that adaptation can succeed, that even the most seemingly obsolete industrial sites can find new relevance if enough people refuse to let them die completely. Hope that organised labour can fight for and win dignity and protections that corporations wouldn't voluntarily provide. Hope that we can learn from past mistakes and build better, more sustainable, more humane industrial operations going forward. The Rouge's story is America's industrial story in microcosm. The ambition and innovation that built it, creating something unprecedented in scale and efficiency. The exploitation and violence that marked its early years, treating workers as expendable components. The union battles that brought some measure of dignity and protection to working people. The peak of prosperity and productive power when American manufacturing seemed unstoppable. The decline as the world changed and the model that worked so brilliantly became increasingly unworkable. The struggle to find new purpose and relevance in a transformed economy. The complex legacy that remains, neither purely good nor purely bad, but profoundly important to understanding where we've been and where we might go. When Detroit ruled the world, when American manufacturing dominated globally, the Rouge was the throne room where that power was most visibly concentrated. That era ended definitively, victim to forces both internal and external, but something survived the transition. Transformed and reduced, but still operating, still employing thousands, still producing vehicles that carry the Ford name. And in an age when American manufacturing seems like a fading memory, when industrial decay symbolizes economic decline, when Rust Belt cities struggle to find new identities, the Rouge stands as both reminder and possibility. Reminder of what was lost when we deindustrialized without planning for consequences. Possibility that even industrial ruins can be reimagined and reborn if we commit the resources and imagination to transforming them. Both warning about the costs of treating workers and environment as expendable, and hope that we can build better, fairer, more sustainable industry if we choose to. The Rouge's legacy isn't simple or comfortable. It's complicated, messy, full of contradictions and tensions, just like the American industrial experience it helped define. Understanding that complexity matters more than celebrating or condemning it simplistically. Because the questions it raises about power, labour, environment, technology, economy, they're still with us. Still demanding answers we haven't fully figured out. Still shaping our world in ways both obvious and subtle. That's why the Rouge story matters. Not just as history, though the history is important, but as ongoing conversation about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, what kind of society and economy we want to build. Those aren't settled questions. The Rouge reminds us they never were. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.